Hello, my dear friends. If you think the Vikings were all about killing and drinking, you probably haven't heard about their bedtime secrets, from bizarre sexual rituals, creepy beliefs about the power of semen, to the practice of testing brides' virginity in front of the whole village. Everything is beyond imagination. Not all stories are told in history books. Some truths are hidden, others are too strange to believe. Tonight, you'll witness what truly happened between Viking sheets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If anyone thinks Viking raids were only about stolen silver and burnt villages, they should know that women were also among the prizes taken home. When a settlement was attacked, the men were often killed first, leaving wives, sisters, and daughters exposed to capture. Those who survived the destruction were carried onto ships, not because they were spared, but because they were considered part of the spoils. Life after that moment rarely resembled freedom. For many of these women, the only choice left was to accept whatever role was forced upon them in a foreign household far from their home. Once brought into Viking lands, some of the women were turned into wives. This word in their context did not mean partnership or equality. It meant possession. A chief could present a captured woman as his new wife, and no one around him would raise a question. For other women, the fate was harsher. They were placed into servitude, expected to cook, clean, farm, and provide satisfaction in silence. It almost feels darkly amusing to see how people in power used the label of marriage to cover what was simply domination. The children born from these unions faced complicated positions. On one hand, they carried the blood of their Viking fathers. On the other hand, their mother's origins placed them lower in the household. Some were accepted and raised, though rarely treated with full legitimacy. Others were hidden away or abandoned entirely. The sagas rarely mention these children directly, but burials and genetic evidence suggest they were present in greater numbers than the texts admit. Their silence in history is itself evidence of how unwelcome their existence was in some families. Chroniclers in the lands attacked by Vikings did not ignore this pattern. Accounts from Ireland, the Frankish kingdoms, and the English coasts mention not only the loss of lives and property, but also the loss of women. These were not rare incidents. They were part of the rhythm of raiding, repeated again and again. For the Vikings, bringing home captives was not seen as shameful. It was considered a natural proof of strength. If we compare it to today, when wars are judged by land gained or governments toppled, for the Vikings, victory could be counted in human bodies taken across the sea. Inside the settlements, the hierarchy among these women was structured but harsh. A woman given to a leader was paraded as a mark of his dominance. She might be dressed in better clothes, but that did not change the lack of choice in her situation. Women given to ordinary warriors had little chance at visibility. They served their captors in daily work and in private, with no protection or voice. In both cases, the concept of refusal did not exist. There were no legal or moral systems to protect the women. Viking society recognized the power of the victor as a form of law. Captivity was not a scandal, it was a fact. For the men, the practice of taking women was not questioned. For the women, survival depended on learning to live inside the rules of a new household. Some eventually blended in, raising children and becoming silent members of the community. Others lived their lives remembering the homes they had been stolen from. Literature that survives from the Viking Age does not often express sympathy for these women. Instead, they appear as trophies in stories, symbols of a raid success. Their names are absent, their voices unheard. Yet archaeological evidence like foreign ornaments found in Viking graves shows that these women did not simply vanish. They were absorbed, willingly or not, into the fabric of Viking life. They carried objects, skills, and bloodlines that marked them as outsiders even generations later. What stands out is how normalized this all was. To the Vikings, it was not extraordinary. It was not a secret. It was openly celebrated as part of warrior culture. I find it unsettling to think about how an entire society could accept something so harsh as ordinary life. This contrast between our moral view and theirs shows how differently humans have justified power across time. Songs in conquered lands kept these memories alive. Folk stories in Ireland and notes from clerics in Francia spoke of the grief of families torn apart. To those communities, raids were remembered less for the silver stolen and more for the women who never returned. Meanwhile, in Viking tradition, the same events were recited as glorious achievements. The two perspectives clashed, but together reveal the full truth. Triumph for one side was lifelong tragedy for the other. Life after capture was marked by silence. Imagine the women on ships leaving the shore of their homeland, watching smoke rise behind them, surrounded by men celebrating their raid. For the warriors, this was a moment of joy, of reward, of proof that the gods favoured them. For the women, it was the start of a journey where freedom had ended. Their voices were not recorded, but their endurance was. This practice left marks that outlasted the Viking Age. It changed bloodlines, reshaped communities, and influenced how Viking power is remembered. Their reputation as explorers and traders is only part of the story. They also built their world on conquest that reached into homes and into the most private parts of life. The truth of their raids is not only written in charred ruins, but in the unspoken lives of women carried into captivity. But captivity was only the beginning, because the Vikings also believed that ritual and sex could shape the fate of their crops and their gods. Underneath the violence of raids and the silence of captured women, another side of Viking intimacy emerges, one that tied the act of sex directly to the cycle of the earth. The Vikings believed that what happened in the bedroom could influence what happened in the fields. Fertility was not only about people, it was also about the soil, the grain, and the animals that kept the community alive. The idea that ritual sex could ensure good harvests was part of their worldview, and it was treated with seriousness, not secrecy. When a chief or leader was prepared to begin the season of planting, it was expected that he would also perform a physical act that symbolized the fertility of the land. In some communities, this ritual was done in private, but in others it was done in front of witnesses. A leader might take a woman considered sacred, often chosen for her purity or her family's standing, and lie with her in a ceremonial setting. This was not framed as a scandal, but as a service. The woman was thought to carry divine blessings, and by joining with her, the leader was believed to transfer that blessing to the soil. The people who gathered did not look away in shame. They accepted it as part of the rhythm of survival. It almost sounds absurd now to think of a village treating sex as part of agriculture. But for them, it was no stranger than using manure to make fields fertile. The choice of women in such rituals was not casual. Often, she was expected to be a virgin, her untouched body seen as the clearest vessel of divine favour. She might be prepared days in advance, bathed, perfumed with herbs, and dressed in garments set aside for the ceremony. The priests would oversee the ritual, chanting and calling upon gods like Freyr, who embodied fertility and growth. Everything about the event was calculated to merge human reproduction with the cycles of nature. Reports from later sagas suggest that such rituals could be performed in public fields or near sacred groves. Fires were lit, animals were sacrificed, and then the human act followed. For the participants, this was not entertainment, it was an obligation. The fate of the harvest was thought to hang in the balance. If the ritual was done correctly, the crops would thrive. If neglected, famine might follow. In their minds, it was a direct transaction with the gods. The power of belief in these rituals meant that women involved carried a strange kind of status. Though they were chosen and guided by priests, their roles were both elevated and diminished. Elevated, because they were believed to channel divine energy. Diminished, because their personal desires or refusals had no place in the event. They were instruments, selected for what they symbolized rather than who they were. Compared to today, where a farmer might pray silently for rain, the Vikings staged their prayers through bodies and actions that were visible to everyone. What interests me is how deeply this practice blurred the boundaries between religion and intimacy. It was not only about a man and a woman, but about the community's relationship with the gods. Sex in this case was not a private act, but a social and spiritual duty. The connection between human and divine was imagined to pass through flesh, into soil, and back into the mouths of the people when harvest came. I often wonder what the women chosen for this truly felt, standing between personal identity and communal expectation. Over time, these rituals left traces in the stories passed down. Some sagas describe festivals where entire groups of people joined in acts of public intimacy, believing that collective fertility would multiply the blessing. Other references are quieter, describing a single union performed at the start of sowing. Whether grand or small, the principle remained the same: sex was a tool of survival, a way to secure life from the gods through symbolic action. Archaeological sites provide clues that support these accounts. Carved images of phallic symbols linked with depictions of grain and livestock suggest a worldview where reproduction in all forms was bound together. Altars found with both animal bones and traces of human bodily fluids hint at the mingling of sacrifice and intimacy. While scholars debate how literal the rituals were, the consistency of symbols across different regions shows that the idea was widely shared. The involvement of leaders in these ceremonies also reinforced their authority. By acting as the one who merged with the sacred woman, the chief positioned himself as the bridge between people and gods. His role was not only military and political, but also sexual and spiritual. This gave him power beyond the battlefield. He could claim that the prosperity of the community flowed directly from his body and his bloodline. For the people, this was reassurance. For the leader, it was legitimacy. For ordinary villagers, the rituals may have been both awe-inspiring and unsettling. To see their leaders enact fertility in such a direct way must have carried a mixture of reverence and discomfort, yet no one openly questioned it. The survival of the harvest was too important, and belief too ingrained, to allow for dissent. What mattered was that the cycle continued, that the fields turned green, and that the gods were satisfied. The practice also shaped gender expectations. Women were tied not only to household duties but also to the symbolic role of maintaining the fertility of the earth. Men, particularly leaders, were expected to prove their virility not just in war but in these ceremonies. Failure in either realm could be seen as weakness, a dangerous flaw in a culture that valued strength above all. As the centuries passed, some of these rituals faded, remembered more in myth than in practice. Yet their echo remained in the stories of gods like Freyr and Freya, whose names were tied to fertility, love, and harvest. In these myths, sex and survival were inseparable, just as they had been in the rituals performed in fields and groves. Rituals tied sex to survival and gave meaning to fertility. But not every belief was wrapped in ceremony or guided by priests. In daily life, the Vikings placed their trust in something far more personal. What might surprise you even more is that for them, attraction often began not with sight or touch, but with the smell of sweat. The everyday life of the Vikings did not revolve only around raids, rituals, and marriage customs. It was also shaped by smaller daily habits that reveal how they understood attraction. One of the most unusual beliefs in their world was the value they placed on body odour. For them, sweat was not something to wash away quickly. It was proof of strength, masculinity, and authenticity. Bathing was not common, and the absence of regular washing created an environment where natural smell became an unavoidable part of life. Instead of seeing it as unpleasant, the Vikings treated it as desirable. The odour of a body was thought to express power in the same way a scar or a weapon did. Men who returned from raids carried more than trophies and stories. They also carried the smell of battle, of sweat mixed with leather and iron. This was not masked or hidden, but celebrated. Women were said to prefer men who carried these scents because they represented courage and vigour. A man who smelled too clean, who had scrubbed away every trace of his body, was thought to lack the rawness expected of a warrior. It is almost laughable to imagine that being sweaty could be more attractive than being clean. Yet in Viking society, this was a mark of real manhood. The practice of infrequent bathing made this preference even more important. Water was scarce in some areas during the colder months, and heating it for bathing was seen as unnecessary work. While some sources suggest that Vikings washed more than their neighbours, they did not do so with the goal of eliminating all natural odour. Instead, they aimed to strike a balance. Too much dirt could weaken health, but too little scent could weaken desire. Sweat was thought to carry the essence of a man's life, and to lose it was to lose the very sign of his strength. For women, managing their scent involved different methods. They often used herbs, grasses, or aromatic plants, not to erase odour, but to blend it with natural smells. The goal was not freshness in the modern sense, but an earthy fragrance that complemented the body. Bundles of thyme, sage, or other plants were sometimes placed under clothing to create a mixture of sweat and herbs. This was considered inviting, not masking. If we compare it to modern life, where deodorants and perfumes are sold to hide or replace natural odour, the Vikings would have seen such products as stripping away what made a body real. The connection between smell and sexuality ran deep into their culture. Warriors who returned from long journeys were believed to carry an aura of strength that spread through their scent. Some sagas even describe how women could identify a victorious man by the odour he brought back with him. This suggests that smell was more than a background detail. It was an active part of the attraction, signalling bravery, success, and vitality. To the Vikings, desire was not shaped by polished appearances but by raw presence. The environment of Viking settlements reinforced this outlook. Longhouses were crowded with smoke, animals, and people. The air was heavy, and personal scent was always present. There was no escape from it, so instead of resisting, they embraced it. A body without odour would have seemed suspicious, perhaps even unhealthy. The sweat of men after work or battle and the natural scent of women after labour were considered honest. In a society where physical survival required constant effort, the smell of exertion was proof of contribution. I find it striking how a detail we might dismiss today could hold such weight in shaping relationships in their time. Travellers from other lands often wrote about Viking hygiene with mixed impressions. Some described them as cleaner than expected, noting that they combed their hair and washed faces more often than neighbouring groups. Others mocked them for being smelly after raids, though this criticism might have been exaggerated by enemies. Regardless, the Vikings themselves did not view odour as a flaw. It was woven into their identity and their understanding of intimacy. A strong smell was not only tolerated but celebrated, seen as a magnet rather than a barrier. Smell also played a role in distinguishing social roles. Warriors, farmers, and labourers carried strong scents from their work, while leaders and women of higher status sometimes softened their presence with herbs and oils. Yet even in those cases, the natural body was not denied. The mixture of sweat and herbs was thought to be richer than either alone. It demonstrated that even elites participated in the natural rhythm of human life, while still signalling refinement. The belief in smell as sexual attraction might also have been reinforced by their mythology. Gods associated with fertility and power, such as Freyr, were tied to the natural world. Their imagery often included earth, animals, and plants, suggesting that nature's rawness was divine. To imitate that rawness in daily life through odour could have been seen as aligning with divine order. This would explain why the scent of a warrior held greater value than artificial attempts to smell pleasant. In practice, this belief shaped interactions between men and women in simple but important ways. A man returning from labour or battle could be welcomed because his odour confirmed his effort. A woman who carried the scent of herbs and sweat was seen as appealing, not because she had erased her humanity, but because she had emphasized it. Intimacy grew from this acceptance, not from denial. The Vikings lived too close to the raw elements of nature to pretend they could escape their bodies. This outlook seems strange now, when cleanliness is often considered part of attraction. Yet for the Vikings, the body was honest in its natural state. To wash too often was to lose the very mark of life. In their minds, odour was not dirt, it was vitality. It was not a sign of neglect, it was a sign of power. By valuing body smell, they turned an unavoidable fact of life into a source of desire, a reminder that strength and survival were the true measures of worth. The smell of warriors and women carried through their halls, mixed with the smoke of fires and the scent of food. It was the background of daily life, the atmosphere in which intimacy unfolded. For them, this was not unpleasant, it was simply real. And from this reality came attraction, relationships, and the continuation of their culture. Smell was enough to define desire, yet when it came to marriage, appearances alone were not enough. Proof of purity was demanded in front of others. Yet stranger still, before marriage even began, a Viking bride could be forced to undergo a public test of her virginity. Marriage among the Vikings was not only about uniting families or strengthening alliances, it was also about control, reputation, and proof. Few customs show this more clearly than the disturbing practice of public virginity testing before a wedding. To us, it seems intrusive and humiliating, but to them, it was part of ensuring honour. A bride could not step into her husband's household without having her purity inspected, sometimes in front of others, and always under the judgment of older members of the community. It was not enough for a family to promise that their daughter was untouched. They had to prove it. The test was usually performed by women who held status in the village, often older relatives or midwives trusted to know the signs. They would examine the bride and declare whether she was still a virgin. This act gave enormous power to those women, but it gave none to the bride herself. Her body became evidence in a trial she could not escape. A single word from the examiner could alter her life, her family's standing, and the future of her marriage. It is almost comical, in a grim sense, how a community could treat a young woman like a contract that had to be inspected before delivery. If the examination revealed that the bride was not a virgin, the consequences could be severe. Her family might be forced to pay a fine, sometimes so heavy it could ruin them. In harsher cases, they could be expelled from the community, marked with shame that lingered for generations. For the bride, the outcome was worse. She could lose her place in the marriage, be discarded, or treated as damaged goods. A mistake or even an inaccurate judgment could destroy her life. What mattered was not truth but perception, and perception was decided by others. Some accounts suggest that the test was not always conducted by women. In certain communities, a man other than the groom might be given the right to test the bride. This blurred the line between inspection and violation, turning the process into something deeply unsettling. It demonstrated that the bride's body was not her own. It belonged to the community, to her family's honour, and to her husband's reputation. She was not a participant in marriage so much as an offering, examined and certified, compared to modern weddings, where the focus is often on love, trust, and shared choice. The Viking custom reminds us that marriage once began with public scrutiny instead of private vows. The involvement of the entire community made this practice even more oppressive. Virginity was not treated as a private matter, but as a public asset. People whispered, judged, and watched as the bride prepared for her test. Even if she passed, the memory of the event lingered. Every woman knew that one day she might stand in the same position, her future depending on the opinion of others. Fear shaped behaviour, and fear ensured compliance. From the perspective of Viking men, this system protected them from dishonour. A groom who married a woman declared impure could be mocked or lose standing among his peers. His family's alliances could weaken, his masculinity questioned. The virginity test was not only about the bride, it was about preserving the man's reputation. By passing the test, a woman confirmed not just her purity but his status as well. Archaeological and literary evidence support the existence of these practices. Some sagas describe disputes where the virginity of a bride was questioned and fines were issued. Legal codes from later Scandinavian history also emphasize the importance of a woman being untouched before marriage. While the methods may have varied, the principle remained the same. The female body was a guarantee of honesty in a transaction between families. The irony is that men faced no such test. Their experience or past actions were irrelevant. A man could have taken women in raids, fathered children with slaves, or engaged in public rituals, and none of it mattered. Only the bride was judged, and her value was measured in physical signs that were often unreliable. The imbalance shows clearly how power worked in Viking society. Men acted, women were judged. I cannot help but feel disturbed by how little room there was for fairness or dignity in these customs. This practice also created opportunities for manipulation. If a family wanted to block a marriage, accusations about a woman's purity could be raised even without evidence. A single claim could stain her permanently. Rumour was enough, and the test was a tool that could be twisted to serve rivalries or grudges. For the bride, there was no defence. She entered the process already at the mercy of others, and once her reputation was questioned, it rarely recovered. The virginity test reflects the way Viking society tied women's worth to reproduction. A bride was valued as the future mother of heirs. Purity was supposed to guarantee that her children would be her husband's alone. It was less about morality than about inheritance. Land, wealth, and titles needed clear lines of descent, and controlling women's bodies was seen as the way to secure them. The test was less about faithfulness and more about property. Inside the homes where these brides lived after passing the test, the memory of the ritual hung over them. They entered marriage having already surrendered their privacy, their bodies made public before they even began life with their husband. The shadow of that humiliation was part of their reality, something they shared silently with other women who had gone through it. While the community may have forgotten quickly, the women themselves could not. What makes this custom striking is not only its cruelty but its acceptance. People did not question it, they believed it was necessary. To them, purity was not an ideal but a condition, as important as land deeds or dowries. Without it, marriage could not proceed. It reveals how societies can normalize what seems unthinkable, how rituals can turn invasion into routine. For the Vikings, testing a bride was as ordinary as arranging the feast or preparing the bed. Over time, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, attitudes toward marriage began to shift. The church discouraged public testing, though suspicion of brides remained strong. The legacy of the custom survived in whispers, stories, and lingering double standards. But in the height of the Viking Age, it was a practice accepted and reinforced by all layers of society. It was woven into the very structure of family and honour. Smell had been enough to stir attraction, but purity was demanded to secure alliances. Women carried the burden of proving what could never truly be proven. Their futures hung in the opinions of others, their lives shaped by rituals that left them exposed before their community. The cruelty lay not only in the act itself, but in how ordinary it seemed to those who enforced it. Virginity tests exposed how little control Viking women had over their bodies, but for slaves, the situation was even more desperate. In their world, intimacy was not a privilege or a right. It was something they could never refuse. Slavery was a constant presence in Viking society, and with it came customs that reveal how differently power and intimacy were understood. To own another person was not only to control their labour, but also to control their body. Men who held slaves, whether male or female, were allowed to demand sexual access without shame or consequence. The concept of refusal did not exist. Slaves had no voice, no rights, and no protection. They were treated as property, and intimacy was another form of service expected from them. For Viking masters, this practice was not hidden. It was accepted openly. A man could own male slaves, female slaves, or both, and use them however he wished. Household duties, field work, and sexual service were all grouped together as parts of slavery. There was no legal structure that defined forced intimacy as a crime. It was simply another part of ownership. It is grimly funny to think how easily they blurred the line between marriage and slavery, as if both were just arrangements of possession. The lives of slaves inside Viking households were marked by constant vulnerability. Women were at risk not only from the master, but also from his sons, guests, and allies. Their bodies could be offered as rewards or tokens of loyalty. Men, too, were not safe. Male slaves could be taken for sexual use by masters, especially when domination was meant to demonstrate authority. In this culture, it was not considered unusual or shameful. It was proof of power, and power justified itself. Children born from these unions faced some of the harshest outcomes. A child of a slave mother could rarely claim the same status as a child of a free woman. In many cases, such children were quietly abandoned or killed at birth. Their existence threatened the purity of family lines and the legitimacy of inheritance. To prevent disputes, families erased them. When children were allowed to live, they often remained in slavery, repeating the cycle of servitude that had shaped their mothers' lives. Compared to modern times, where society wrestles with issues of equality and rights, the Viking view seems brutally clear. A slave was never more than a tool, no matter what bonds of blood were formed. Inside longhouses, the presence of slaves was unavoidable. They cooked the meals, tended the fires, cleaned the garments, and lay at the mercy of their masters. The atmosphere of these halls carried constant reminders of hierarchy. Free women of the household might supervise work, but even they had little power to shield slaves from sexual demands. The structure of society did not recognize consent. What mattered was ownership, and ownership overruled all. The sagas and poems of the Viking Age rarely dwell on the voices of slaves. Instead, they appear in the background, nameless and silent. When mentioned, they are often described in terms of usefulness, beauty, or fertility, never individuality. This erasure mirrors their lived reality. They were not meant to be remembered as people, only as property. Yet between the lines, their presence is undeniable. The very absence of detail in the record shows how common their exploitation was, so ordinary that it did not require explanation. Slavery in Viking lands was fed by raids. Women taken from conquered villages often became slaves, and their fates included forced intimacy. These captives were brought across seas and placed in homes where their roles shifted depending on the needs of their masters. Some were forced into the beds of warriors, others were used for labour first, intimacy second. Regardless, the lack of choice was absolute. Survival meant compliance. Resistance was punished swiftly and cruelly. The religious beliefs of the Vikings did not challenge this system. While gods were invoked in rituals of fertility, there was no divine rule protecting slaves from abuse. On the contrary, mythology reinforced ideas of dominance, where the strong claimed what they desired. The logic of war carried into the household. Just as conquered villages were stripped of wealth, conquered people were stripped of autonomy. It was not questioned. It was celebrated as part of the victory. What strikes me most is how normalized this system became. It was not a hidden crime, but a daily reality woven into the structure of society. I often find it disturbing to imagine how ordinary people could live with such cruelty and never see it as an injustice. The difference in perception between then and now is a reminder of how flexible human morality can be, depending on who holds power. Legal codes from later centuries provide glimpses of how these practices were justified. Laws might set penalties for harming another man's slave, not out of concern for the slave, but for the owner's property. A slave's value was measured in silver, and their loss could be compensated in coin, their bodies, their children. Their lives were reduced to numbers in a transaction. Even when acknowledged, it was never as human suffering but as an economic cost. The psychological toll on slaves cannot be fully known, but traces remain in the patterns of silence. Generations of captives lived and died without names recorded. Their endurance was absorbed into Viking households, their contributions forgotten. Yet the genetic record tells another story. Modern studies reveal traces of foreign ancestry in Scandinavian populations, evidence that not all children of slaves were erased. Some survived, carried forward the bloodlines, and became silent witnesses in DNA. Slavery also reinforced the image of the master as absolute authority. His ability to demand intimacy from any person in his household was a demonstration of dominance. It reminded everyone, free or enslaved, that he controlled life at every level. This authority extended to his heirs, shaping the culture of entitlement that surrounded Viking men of rank. To refuse a master was unthinkable. To suffer in silence was expected. As with many Viking practices, what shocks us today was normalized then. The absence of the concept of rape in relation to slaves did not mean the violence was less real. It meant it was invisible, buried beneath the language of property. For the Vikings, intimacy without consent was not a violation but routine, part of the order of life. This silence in their culture is perhaps the loudest proof of how deeply oppression was built into their society. Children who did survive carried heavy marks of difference. They were often excluded from inheritance, their status questioned, their lives shadowed by their mother's servitude. In some cases, they were raised as reminders of conquest, living symbols of their father's power. In others, they were denied even that, fading into obscurity as expendable. Each outcome reinforces the harsh reality that for the Vikings, the lives and deaths of slaves and their children were matters of convenience, not morality. Slavery in Viking society was not an exception, it was a foundation. To understand their world, one must face this truth. Behind the ships, the trade, and the sagas were countless lives taken, silenced, and used. Their stories may not be carved into runes, but they are written in the shadows of history, reminding us that Viking power was built on the bodies of the powerless. Life for slaves was filled with silence and fear. Their bodies were treated as possessions without a voice. But not every woman lived under such control, because some Viking women were powerful enough to choose many lovers and even gather harems of their own. Among the many customs that shaped Viking intimacy, one stands out for how it broke the pattern of male control. While slaves and ordinary women were denied choice, women of high rank or strength sometimes held unusual freedom. A female warrior or the wife of a powerful chieftain could take lovers without shame. In fact, her status could protect her, turning what would be considered dishonor for another woman into a symbol of power. This was not common for every household, but when it happened, it revealed how differently strength was measured in Viking society. For these women, the authority they held gave them room to step outside the normal restrictions of marriage. A husband might have been feared by others, but inside his hall, he often respected the will of a wife who carried both noble blood and personal influence. If she wanted a lover, she could claim one, and no man dared to question it. To resist her choice was to risk more than embarrassment. In some stories, men who refused her or spoke against her met swift punishment. It is strangely amusing to imagine that in a world built on men's conquests, some of the fiercest conquerors inside the home were women. The warriors who became lovers of these women sometimes did so willingly, drawn by the honour of serving a powerful figure. Others had little choice but to comply, knowing that refusal could cost them their lives. For the women, these relationships were not framed as shameful. They were signs of dominance, another way to display their strength. A man might boast of his victories on the battlefield, but a woman could demonstrate her authority by choosing who shared her bed. There are accounts in sagas of women who gathered groups of lovers, almost like small harems, echoing the power their husbands held with their followers. These groups were not formal institutions, but collections of men who became bound to a woman by her will. Such stories show that Viking culture, for all its emphasis on male strength, also allowed space for female defiance when backed by status. The wife of a chieftain or a respected warrior woman could bend rules that others could never touch. This practice also reflects the way Vikings admired strength in all forms. A woman who commanded fear or respect could act with the same freedom as a man. Her reputation mattered more than her gender. She did not need to hide her lovers. In some cases, her actions were even admired, turned into tales of cunning and power, compared to today, where equality is often measured by laws and rights. Viking equality appeared only in flashes, granted by force of will and the threat of violence. Inside the longhouses where these women lived, the atmosphere must have been tense. Men chosen as lovers had to accept their place, knowing they were replaceable. Husbands, often leaders themselves, sometimes tolerated these arrangements because they reinforced the image of their household as untouchable. To be married to a woman so powerful that she could keep lovers was not always considered humiliation. It could be seen as proof that their household stood above ordinary rules. For ordinary women, however, this freedom was unimaginable. A farmer's wife or the daughter of a merchant would never dare to take a lover openly. To do so would risk punishment, exile, or death. The difference shows how much power rested not in custom but in strength. Only those strong enough to command fear could escape the boundaries placed on others. For most women, the rules of purity and obedience still applied without mercy. What fascinates me is the duality of this system. On one side, women were treated as property, tested for purity, and controlled through marriage. On the other hand, women of influence could twist those same rules to their advantage, turning intimacy into another weapon of authority. I find it both unsettling and intriguing that a society so rigid could still bend its rules when faced with undeniable power. The sagas preserve these contradictions. Some tell of women who directed battles, advised kings, and kept lovers openly. Others portray women punished for even the suggestion of infidelity. These stories reveal not only how diverse Viking life could be, but also how much it depended on status. Freedom was not evenly shared. It was granted by fear, respect, and lineage. The presence of harems among powerful women shows another layer of Viking identity. Just as men collected followers and allies, some women collected lovers. It was a way to display control, to prove that they were not bound by the same limits as others. For the men involved, survival meant obedience. For the women, it was a demonstration that strength could reshape even the most personal aspects of life. In the context of Viking belief, these practices may have carried symbolic weight. Gods like Freya, associated with love and desire, were themselves portrayed as taking many lovers. To imitate the gods was not seen as scandal, but as natural. A woman who behaved like a goddess reinforced her aura of power, aligning herself with divine freedom. This mythological backdrop gave legitimacy to actions that might otherwise have been condemned. The existence of such women did not erase the suffering of others, but it reminds us that Viking intimacy was not one simple story of male domination. It was a spectrum shaped by status, strength, and circumstance. For most, there was no choice. For a few, choice was limitless. and those few became legends, remembered not only for their lineage but for the audacity of bending society to their will. Powerful women could bend the rules inside their households, but even ordinary marriages carried stories that slipped beyond control. The sagas themselves record affairs and betrayals, treating them less as disgrace and more as tales of conquest. Affairs in Viking society were not always treated as scandals. The sagas record them in detail, presenting stories of women who took lovers outside their marriages and men who accepted or ignored these betrayals. For modern readers, these accounts sound like evidence of chaos within households, but for the Vikings, they could be remembered as tales of adventure and conquest. A marriage might have been built on alliances, tests of purity, and public ceremonies, but desire often ignored those structures. The sagas did not erase these moments. They carved them into memory, making them part of the cultural record. The image of a wife taking lovers while her husband was away appears more than once in Viking stories. These women were not always shamed. Sometimes their actions were described with the same excitement used to narrate battles. The act of stepping outside marriage could be framed as boldness, a demonstration of freedom. This does not mean every community accepted infidelity, but it does show that Viking culture made room for contradictions. In one setting, a woman could be punished for impurity. In another, her affair could be sung as a triumph. It is almost humorous to imagine that betrayal at home could be retold with the same pride as victory in war. The sagas themselves are full of layered characters, and many women stand out for their roles in these affairs. Some are depicted as restless, unwilling to wait for their husbands to return from raids. Others are shown as calculating, using intimacy as a way to build alliances or weaken rivals. These stories reflect not just human desire, but also the political value of relationships. A secret lover could become an ally. An affair could shift loyalties. The personal and the political were never far apart. What makes these accounts unique is the lack of shame attached to them. Modern expectations would cast an affair as dishonour. Yet Viking stories often describe them with admiration, as if they proved the woman's cleverness or strength. Affairs became part of a saga's drama, placed alongside duels and voyages. Instead of hiding the act, the stories highlight it, turning private choices into public memory. Compared to today, when private scandals often damage reputations, the Viking way of immortalizing them in tales feels like a complete reversal. In one saga, a wife of a chieftain takes a lover while her husband is away, and when discovered, the focus is less on her guilt than on the boldness of the act itself. The saga celebrates her daring rather than condemning it. In another, a woman uses affairs to challenge her husband's authority, showing that she is not confined by marriage. These examples reveal how sagas worked less like moral guides and more like records of power. If a woman's affair demonstrated her will, it was worth remembering. Within Viking society, this freedom was not equally shared. Ordinary women, especially those without family support or status, risked punishment for stepping outside their marriages, but women of higher rank, or those connected to influential men, had more room to act. Their status shielded them, and their affairs could even be admired as symbols of vitality. The sagas often tell the stories of these women, leaving the silent majority in the shadows. The double standard is clear. Men's affairs were expected and rarely questioned. Women's affairs, while sometimes celebrated, were still dangerous if they crossed the wrong lines. Yet the fact that they are remembered at all suggests that Viking culture did not silence these stories. Instead, it preserved them, sometimes twisting them into lessons, sometimes turning them into entertainment. The sagas remind us that intimacy in Viking life was not only controlled by law or ritual, it was also shaped by rebellion and defiance. The presence of these stories shows how open the Vikings were about desire. Affairs were not erased or hidden away, but made into part of their shared identity. They may have been exaggerated, as all stories are, but exaggeration itself proves that such acts were possible and meaningful. A woman who strayed from her husband could still be respected, even admired, if her actions aligned with the saga's themes of boldness and strength. For the women themselves, affairs could be a rare chance at choice. In a society where many aspects of life were dictated by family or community, intimacy outside marriage allowed a woman to assert control, however briefly. These relationships may have been secret at the time, but once recorded in the sagas, they became permanent. The women's names lived on, their choices immortalized. To some, this may have been a form of liberation, however limited. I cannot help but think about how powerful it must have felt for these women to know their actions would be remembered, not erased. The sagas also reveal the reactions of husbands and communities. Sometimes men fought duels over affairs, framing the issue as a matter of honor. Other times, they tolerated or ignored them, perhaps recognizing the futility of resistance. In both cases, the stories suggest that affairs were not rare. They were part of the rhythm of Viking life, acknowledged openly, even if not always approved. In households, the atmosphere around these affairs must have been tense. Servants and relatives often knew what was happening, yet silence was necessary to preserve peace. At feasts and gatherings, rumours could spread quickly, turning private acts into public knowledge. But rather than ending lives or destroying families, these affairs often became new stories to tell, fuel for the sagas that defined Viking memory. The existence of these tales challenges the idea that Viking society was uniform in its rules. On one hand, purity tests and restrictions on women's choices show strict control. On the other hand, sagas celebrating affairs reveal flexibility, even admiration for defiance. Together, they paint a picture of a society that valued strength in all forms, including the strength to break boundaries. Affairs were not always acts of passion alone. They could be strategic, playful, or rebellious. They added layers to Viking households, shaping relationships in ways that went beyond marriage contracts. While they brought risk, they also brought recognition. The women who engaged in them became part of the cultural fabric, remembered for their audacity. In the end, the sagas remind us that Viking intimacy was never simple. It was bound by rituals, shaped by power, and yet constantly pushed against by personal choices. Affairs were not erased. They were woven into the stories that defined the age, showing that even in a society ruled by warriors, women carved out space for their desires. Marriages were supposed to hold households together, but affairs revealed how fragile those bonds could be. The sagas that tell of betrayal and passion also prepare us for the next layer of Viking intimacy, where even jealousy itself was treated not as strength, but as weakness. Jealousy, a feeling so common in many cultures, was treated very differently in the Viking world. While in most societies a man who defended his wife's honour might be praised, among the Vikings such a reaction could be seen as weakness. A husband who showed jealousy risked mockery, labelled as being controlled by his wife. In sagas and poems, the man who could not control his emotions was not respected. Instead, he was ridiculed. The Vikings prized strength and independence, and jealousy was the opposite of both. In their worldview, to be jealous meant admitting dependence on another person's loyalty. A strong warrior was expected to control his household with confidence, not anxiety. If his wife strayed, the blame was rarely placed on her but on his lack of authority. To show anger or sorrow in public was worse than the act itself. It revealed fragility. It is almost darkly amusing that a man could conquer in battle but lose respect simply by showing he cared too much about his wife's choices. The sagas contain episodes where husbands are mocked for their jealousy. One tale describes a man whose wife was known for taking lovers. When he confronted her, his peers laughed at him, calling him weak. Instead of sympathy, he received scorn. For the community, his failure was not that his wife was unfaithful, but that he cared. The proper response was to ignore or even accept it. The greatest shame was not betrayal, but emotional reaction. This cultural outlook shaped behavior in marriages. Husbands learned to hide their feelings, even when they knew of affairs. To speak openly would damage their reputation. To act possessively was worse than to remain silent. The result was a society where jealousy became an insult, used in poems and insults to attack men's honour. A rival could mock another by calling him wife-ruled, suggesting he lacked true strength. For Vikings, control meant calm detachment, not emotional outbursts. This detachment extended into practices that seem shocking today. In some sagas, husbands are recorded as gifting their wives to trusted friends or allies. What might appear as betrayal was instead framed as generosity or loyalty. A man who allowed his friend to sleep with his wife demonstrated confidence, showing that he did not fear loss or humiliation. Such acts were not always common, but their presence in the stories proves they carried symbolic meaning. They reminded others that men owned, rather than clung to, their households. Compared to modern times, where jealousy is often proof of passion, in Viking society, it was evidence of weakness and a fragile spirit. Inside the household, this expectation must have shaped relationships in subtle ways. Wives knew that their husbands would not openly show jealousy, no matter what they did. This could give women more room to act than in societies where husbands imposed stricter control. At the same time, it created distance. A wife could not expect her husband to show protective anger. Instead, she might live with silence, unsure if it came from confidence or indifference. The absence of jealousy changed how intimacy felt, reducing the emotional ties that might have existed elsewhere. The cultural rejection of jealousy also fit into Viking ideals of masculinity. A man was measured by strength, honour, and self-control. Losing his temper over a wife's actions undermined all three. To maintain status, he needed to appear above personal feelings, almost detached from household drama. This mirrored the warrior's discipline on the battlefield. Just as a warrior did not flinch under pain, a husband was not supposed to flinch under betrayal. The appearance of indifference became a form of armour at feasts and gatherings. This attitude played out in public banter. Men insulted one another with jokes about wives and lovers, testing each other's reactions. The one who laughed along proved his strength. The one who grew angry revealed weakness. These exchanges reinforced the idea that jealousy was shameful. Social standing depended not only on victory in raids, but also on the ability to endure mockery without showing hurt. For women, the rejection of jealousy could open doors. Some wives used the silence of their husbands as freedom, engaging in affairs with less fear of public punishment. Their husbands might not like it, but they rarely dared to show emotion. The sagas reflect this tension. They tell of women whose actions tested boundaries, knowing that the greatest risk was not their behaviour, but their husbands' reactions. As long as men stayed silent, women's choices could slip by. At the same time, this freedom was dangerous. A husband who appeared too passive risked his reputation. He could be challenged by rivals, accused of weakness, and even lose authority in his household. So while open jealousy was mocked, quiet control still mattered. Men had to balance silence with subtle actions, ensuring they kept power without exposing feelings. The result was a culture where marriages carried layers of hidden tension, with both sides aware of what could and could not be shown in public. This outlook also explains why betrayal appears so often in sagas. Affairs and exchanges of wives were not erased but woven into the stories of warriors and households. They added drama, but they also reinforced values. The man who tolerated infidelity without jealousy was not destroyed by it. Instead, he remained powerful. The sagas remind us that strength was not about perfect households, but about an unshakable reputation. Archaeological evidence cannot capture emotions, but it does reveal the material side of these relationships. Items exchanged between households, including jewellery and clothing, suggest networks of alliance that may have included wives as symbols of trust. While we cannot know how individuals felt, the broader culture made clear that intimacy was tied to power. Jealousy had no place in such transactions. For modern readers, this approach is difficult to accept. It clashes with the idea that love and loyalty are built on exclusivity. Yet for the Vikings, intimacy was secondary to strength. What mattered most was how one appeared before others. A man could survive betrayal, but he could not survive ridicule. I often think about how cold it must have felt to live in a society where silence was valued more than honest emotion. In the end, jealousy in Viking culture was not a sign of passion, but of weakness. To care too much was to lose control, and control was everything. Their rejection of jealousy reflects a society built on power, pride, and appearances. The sagas capture this truth, mocking jealous husbands and praising those who remained unshaken. Affairs may have been tolerated and jealousy despised, but these stories only set the stage for another layer of Viking intimacy. Beyond personal affairs, some men faced challenges that tested them in more public ways, competing directly for women in contests of strength and desire. Viking society admired strength, courage, and the ability to prove oneself in every aspect of life. Battles were not fought only with swords and shields. Some challenges were carried into the most intimate spaces, where men were expected to show power in ways that still shock us today. Among these customs was a practice described in sagas as sexual competition, where warriors tested themselves not only in combat but also in the bedroom. A man might have to satisfy a woman to win her hand, and his success or failure could determine his honour, his future, and even his life. This practice was not widespread in every community, but the sagas and poems suggest it existed strongly enough to become a recognised theme. The idea was simple in form but brutal in consequence. Two or more warriors might seek the same bride. Instead of settling the matter with weapons, they proved themselves through sexual performance. The woman became the judge, and her decision shaped reputations. What was intended as marriage became a contest, one that carried the same weight as a duel. It is almost laughable to think that Viking honour could rest not on a battlefield but on a bed. Yet this was exactly how some stories remembered it. For the warriors, the stakes were enormous. To fail in such a contest was not only personal embarrassment, it was public humiliation. A man who could not prove his virility might lose all respect from his peers. The sagas describe cases where defeated men were mocked, their names tied forever to failure. In a culture built on pride, such dishonour was unbearable. Some men, unable to live with the shame, were said to have taken their own lives. The seriousness with which these contests were treated shows how central sexuality was to Viking identity. It was not a private act, but a measure of worth. The woman involved carried significant power in these situations. Her satisfaction determined the outcome, and her words could raise one man while destroying another. This power was rare for women in Viking culture, where choices were often limited. In these contests, however, the woman became the centre of judgment. Her role was both respected and feared. To be chosen as the subject of a challenge meant being placed at the heart of male rivalry, a position that carried risk as well as influence. Sagas often describe these events with striking detail. Unlike battles, which were sometimes summarised quickly, these contests were remembered for their intimacy. The descriptions focus on the acts themselves, on the performance of the men, and on the reaction of the woman. For Viking audiences, these stories must have been both entertaining and instructive. They reinforced the idea that strength was not complete without virility. A man could be a great fighter, but if he failed in bed, his reputation was broken. Compared to modern times, where personal intimacy is considered private, Viking sagas remind us of a world where sex could become a public spectacle. The psychological pressure on men was immense. To prepare for a duel of swords was one thing. To prepare for a duel of intimacy, with honour at stake, must have carried fear of a different kind. Success brought pride and marriage. Failure brought ridicule and sometimes death. This shows how fully the Vikings tied masculinity to performance. A man's body was not only a weapon in war but also a tool of reputation in private life. Women's perspectives, while harder to trace, can be imagined through the consequences of their judgment. A woman who declared one man successful and another a failure shaped more than her future. She influenced the standing of warriors, families, and alliances. The weight of such decisions must have been heavy, yet sagas portray them as decisive. They did not hesitate. Their words were final. In a society where women's voices were often muted, this rare moment of power stands out, even though it came through a troubling context. These contests also served as a form of ritual. They were not only about marriage, but also about proving the readiness of a man to take on the responsibilities of family and household. A warrior who failed in intimacy was thought to lack the strength needed for leadership. Virility was seen as directly connected to vitality. The ability to satisfy a woman was interpreted as the ability to sustain life, to father children, and to maintain prosperity. In this way, the contest was symbolic as well as literal. At feasts, such stories would have been retold with both laughter and seriousness. Men boasted of their victories, while failures were turned into insults. A defeated man's name might live on as a joke, ensuring that his shame never faded. Honor was fragile, and even one failure could outweigh a lifetime of achievements. This shows how unforgiving Viking society could be. It demanded excellence in every field, even in the most private ones. The sagas that record these events are not simply tales of entertainment. They reveal how the Vikings linked every part of life to competition. Farming, raiding, politics, and intimacy were all arenas for proving strength. The line between public and private was thin, and reputation was always at risk. For modern readers, the detail of these accounts can feel intrusive. Yet for the Vikings, there were lessons about courage, stamina, and pride. I find it deeply unsettling that a society could turn private failure into a death sentence. But it also shows how seriously they took the idea of honour. Archaeological evidence does not directly confirm such contests, but the cultural emphasis on virility is clear. Symbols of fertility, carvings of exaggerated male forms, and references in poetry all point to the same value masculinity was measured in performance. The contest described in sagas may have been exaggerated, but exaggeration itself suggests that the practice, or at least the idea of it, was familiar to audiences. What remains clear is that sexual competition reflected the Viking obsession with testing limits. They did not confine competition to battlefields. Every part of life became a trial. To live among them was to live under constant expectation, never free from judgment. Success brought respect. Failure destroyed it. This truth applied to warriors, farmers, and leaders alike. Intimacy was simply one more arena where strength had to be proved. These stories remind us that Viking society was built on extremes. Honor was everything, and dishonor was unbearable. Sexual contests may sound shocking, even absurd, but they fit perfectly into a culture that prized rivalry. For the Vikings, to compete was to exist, and to exist without competition was unthinkable. Affairs had already blurred the lines of loyalty, and jealousy had been mocked as weakness. Sexual contests pushed these ideas further, turning intimacy into another battlefield. But even stranger than these challenges was the belief that some women lay with gods or monsters, creating legends that blurred the boundary between human and divine. Viking belief was not limited to the visible world of ships, raids, and farms. Much of their culture rested on the idea that gods, spirits, and strange creatures moved constantly among them. In this space between the natural and the supernatural, sexuality was often described in ways that blurred the line between human and divine. The sagas and later tales contain references to women who were said to have been visited by gods, possessed by spirits, or even approached by monstrous beings. These stories were not told as nightmares but as explanations for unusual births, powerful descendants, and the blending of the human with the mythical. One recurring theme was the belief that a woman could be entered or possessed by a god during states of trance or sleep. Such encounters were described as physical unions, leaving the woman exhausted but filled with the presence of the divine. These moments were often linked to prophecy or special powers granted to her or her children. For the people who heard these stories, the boundary between hallucination and reality did not matter. What mattered was that the gods had chosen to cross into human lives through the act of intimacy. It is almost grimly funny that what we might dismiss today as a dream or delusion was treated as evidence of holy desire. Another theme found in the stories is the visitation of monstrous figures, sometimes described as dragons or other powerful beasts. A tale might describe a woman in a temple or sacred space who claimed to have been approached by such a creature at night. These unions were not always seen as shameful. On the contrary, they were presented as extraordinary, marking the woman as touched by forces beyond the ordinary. If a child were born later with unusual traits, these traits could be explained as the inheritance of the supernatural father. The children of such unions were remembered with fascination. If a boy showed remarkable strength or a girl displayed unusual beauty or skill, it was said to be the blood of gods flowing in their veins. Sometimes deformities or strange features were also explained this way. Instead of seeing them as misfortunes, families might present them as signs of divine lineage. A child with a crooked limb or a strange face could be called the son or daughter of a god, giving the family prestige, compared to the modern world, where unusual traits are explained by science. Viking society often preferred to see them as proof of divine or monstrous heritage. These stories also reflect the way religion and sexuality were deeply tied together in Viking life. The gods themselves, such as Odin, Freya, or Frey,